Why is it that in the middle of a heated argument, when voices rise or silence freezes the room, something deeper than disagreement begins to stir inside us? Why does conflict feel so personal, so explosive, as if the other person has reached into the most hidden corner of our being and touched a place we rarely, if ever, acknowledge? And what if arguments aren't actually about the topic at all? Not about the dishes, not about the timing, not even about the person in front of us, but about something far older, far quieter, living within. Many of us fear conflict because we think it threatens our peace, our relationships, our sense of control. But what if conflict is not an intruder? What if it is a mirror? As Carl Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And maybe that is the secret we have been avoiding. Not that arguments destroy connection, but that they illuminate the parts of ourselves we've spent a lifetime trying to contain. Today, we're not here to analyze who was right or wrong in your last disagreement. We're here to gently peel back the layers beneath the frustration, beneath the defensiveness, beneath the stories we tell about why people trigger us. Because inside every conflict lies a doorway, and behind that doorway stands your shadow. Jung believed the shadow is everything we push away, everything we deny, everything we secretly fear we might be. And arguments? They are the moments when the shadow stops whispering and begins to speak. So before we dive deeper, take a breath. Let the noise settle. Let the room inside you widen a little. Because this journey isn't about blame, it's about understanding. It's about meeting the parts of yourself that have been waiting in the dark for far too long. And maybe, just maybe, by the end of this first step, you'll begin to see conflict not as a threat, but as an invitation. Let's begin where most conflicts quietly begin, with a small spark. A comment that shouldn't matter. A tone that feels sharper than it was meant to be. A moment when something inside you flinches before you even understand why. We often tell ourselves, I'm overreacting, or they're being unreasonable. But underneath those quick judgments lies a much more intimate story. Because the truth is, the intensity you feel during an argument rarely comes from the present moment. It comes from the past echoing through it. As Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And nowhere is this more evident than in conflict. When someone speaks in a way that touches an old wound, a forgotten insecurity, or a piece of the shadow you've tried to tame, your whole being reacts. Not because the moment is dangerous, but because it is familiar. Conflict is the place where the self we show the world collides with the self we keep hidden. The polite mask slips, the carefully curated calm fractures, and suddenly, the parts of you thought you had outgrown or buried, fear, defensiveness, judgment, longing, anger, rise to the surface seeking recognition. Arguments don't create these emotions, they reveal them. This is why two people can hear the same words but experience entirely different realities. One person hears feedback, another hears abandonment. One hears a question, the other hears accusation. The shadow translates everything into the language of your deepest unresolved stories. But here is the gentle beauty in all of this. Conflict is not a failure. It's a flashlight, a guide, a message from your psyche saying, here, this is where you are still hurting. This is where you still need understanding. And if you learn to listen, not defensively, not with blame, but with curiosity, the argument becomes something sacred, a map back to yourself. So before we judge our reactions or label ourselves as too much, maybe we can pause and ask, what is this moment trying to show me? Because every conflict contains a truth waiting to be heard. There comes a moment in almost every argument when something shifts inside you. A tightening in the chest, a heat behind the eyes, a sudden urge to defend, to explain, to withdraw, or to attack. It feels instinctive, irresistible, almost automatic. And maybe that's because it is. In that split second, the shadow steps forward, not as an enemy, but as a messenger, Carl Jung described the shadow as the collection of traits, emotions, and impulses we disown because they don't fit the image we want to uphold. We tuck them away, believing that if we hide them long enough, they'll disappear. But shadows don't vanish. They wait. And conflict is one of the rare moments when the unconscious finds an opening wide enough to speak. When someone says something that sets you off, they're not creating the fire, they're lighting the fuse of a wound you've been carrying. A wound you've learned to manage, to mask, to intellectualize, but perhaps never fully healed. That's why certain arguments feel disproportionately intense. You're not just reacting to the present. You're reacting to every moment in your past when you felt misunderstood, dismissed, or unseen. And yet, this is exactly where the transformation begins. Because every time your shadow rises in conflict, it is showing you a truth about yourself you've been too busy or too afraid to notice. Your shadow is not trying to harm you. It is trying to complete you. In Jung's view, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And arguments, raw, uncomfortable, unfiltered, are among the most honest mirrors we ever encounter. They reveal where you still crave approval, where you fear rejection, where control has become a shield, where tenderness has become a risk. What if instead of shaming ourselves for these reactions, we learned to greet them? What if conflict wasn't a battlefield, but a classroom? A place where the psyche says, "Look here. This is the part of you asking to be understood." The shadow isn't the enemy of peace. It is the path to it. If you look closely at your most heated arguments, you might notice a subtle pattern. Beneath the frustration, beneath the words you fling or swallow, beneath the explanations and counter-explanations, there is a quiet longing for control. Not because you want power over someone else, but because you're trying to hold together the parts of yourself that feel too fragile to expose. Conflict threatens that delicate structure. It presses against the edges of the persona. The mask Jung said we all wear to appear stable, confident, composed. And when the persona cracks, even slightly, the shadow slips through. We don't try to control conversations, emotions, or outcomes because we're domineering. We do it because we're afraid. Afraid of appearing weak. Afraid of being misunderstood. Afraid that if we let go, something inside us might escape. A truth we're not ready to face. That's why a simple disagreement can feel like a storm. Your body braces. Your mind races. Your voice trembles or sharpens. And in that moment, you're not fighting the other person. You're fighting to keep your inner world from spilling out. But as Carl Jung said, what you resist not only persists, but grows. The more you try to control the narrative, the more your shadow pushes back, demanding to be seen. Arguments reveal where your inner landscape has become rigid, where beliefs have calcified, where fears have taken root, where tenderness has been locked away. Conflict doesn't break you. It exposes where you've already been breaking. Yet within that exposure lies an opening. A moment when you can soften instead of harden. A moment when you can ask yourself, why did this touch me so deeply? What am I trying to protect? Because every attempt at control is really an attempt to guard a wound. This is the uncomfortable paradox. The more tightly we grip ourselves, the more conflict shakes us. But when we stop gripping, when we allow ourselves to be human, imperfect, and process, the argument becomes less of a battlefield and more of a lantern. It lights the part of the psyche begging for liberation. And suddenly, control is no longer the goal. Understanding is. There's a moment in almost every argument when you suddenly feel younger than you are. Not in the playful sense, but in that raw, exposed way. As if the person in front of you has unknowingly touched a bruise that formed years before they ever entered your life. And it's in this moment that the psyche reveals one of its deepest patterns. Conflict doesn't just awaken the shadow, it awakens your history. As Carl Jung often hinted, the unconscious is timeless. It doesn't distinguish between old pain and new experiences. It simply reacts. So when someone raises their voice, withdraws, questions you, interrupts you, or misunderstands you, the emotional intensity isn't born in the room. It's summoned from memory, from the child who felt unheard, from the adolescent who felt dismissed, from the adult who learned to hide softness to survive. This is why arguments can feel so disproportionately heavy. You're not just defending your point, you're defending younger versions of yourself who never got the chance to speak. In Jung's view, these old wounds form complexes, clusters of emotional energy that lie dormant until something activates them. And conflict is one of the most potent activators. A single phrase can awaken a buried narrative. A frustrated sigh can resurrect a forgotten fear. A moment of tension can open a door to a room you thought you had sealed shut. But here's the unexpected grace in all of this. These activations aren't punishments. They are revelations. They show you where you are still tender, still longing, still incomplete in your own self-understanding. And while most people see conflict as destructive, Jung would say it is a call toward integration. A reminder that healing doesn't happen by avoiding tension. It happens by meeting what rises within it. So when your chest tightens, when your voice wavers, when defensiveness rushes in like a tide, try not to shame yourself. Instead, ask, which part of me is speaking right now? The adult or the echo? Because arguments don't expose your weakness. They expose the parts of you that are ready, finally, to be healed. If there is one force that quietly shapes the unfolding of every argument, it is this: projection. Jung called projection the unconscious act of seeing our own disowned qualities in someone else. And nowhere does this happen more fiercely than in conflict. Because in the heat of tension, the mind does something subtle yet powerful. It turns the other person into a canvas for our own unresolved stories. Think about the last time someone upset you. Maybe you accused them of not listening, of being careless, of being distant or demanding. But pause for a moment. What if, beneath those accusations, lies a deeper truth? What if the parts of them you find most irritating are reflections of the parts you have not yet accepted within yourself? As Carl Jung said, we always see in others what we carry within. The traits we admire in people mirror our dormant potential. The traits we despise mirror our rejected shadow. And during arguments, projection becomes louder than reason. When you feel attacked, maybe the other person is not attacking. You are projecting your fear of inadequacy. When you feel controlled, maybe you are projecting the part of you that craves control. When you feel dismissed, maybe the real wound is how often you dismiss your own needs. Projection makes the other person feel larger, scarier, or more powerful than they truly are. It distorts reality, turning a simple disagreement into a symbolic battle. And until you recognize projection, every conflict becomes a replay of an inner drama rather than a meeting between two conscious adults. But here is the gift wrapped inside this painful dynamic. Projection reveals what you are ready to reclaim. If someone's anger unsettles you, perhaps you need to meet your own anger with compassion. If their silence wounds you, perhaps you fear your own quiet. If their intensity overwhelms you, perhaps you have silenced your own intensity for too long. Jung believed that the moment you withdraw your projections, you reclaim pieces of your soul. Conflict, then, becomes a treasure map, not to blame, but to integration. To take back what you once tried to exile. So the next time you find yourself thinking, they always, or they never, pause. Ask yourself, is this really them? Or is this me, reflected back? Because conflict isn't just a clash of personalities. It's a meeting of mirrors. There's a point in every argument when something inside you shifts so suddenly you barely notice it happening. One moment you're present, aware, grounded. And the next, it's as if you've stepped outside of yourself, watching your words spill out faster than your consciousness can edit them. Your voice tightens. Your gestures sharpen. You say things you don't mean, or maybe things you've been holding in for years. This is the moment Jungian psychology calls possession by the complex. It's when a charged emotional pattern takes the wheel of your psyche. You, the conscious self, the one who wants peace and understanding, temporarily fades into the background. The argument becomes less about now and more about everything unresolved. You're no longer speaking as your present self. You're speaking as the version of you who learned to protect, defend, or disappear. Jung described this feeling well. A person is no longer himself but becomes what he fights. And in conflict, you can feel it. The argument stops being a conversation and becomes a surge of instinct, like your system is trying to rescue you from a danger that doesn't actually exist. But here lies the quiet tragedy. When the complex takes over, the real you is momentarily lost. And that's why afterward you feel exhausted, ashamed, or confused, wondering, why did I react like that? That didn't even feel like me. It wasn't you. It was a part of you, an old, unintegrated part, trying desperately to be heard. The beauty, however, is that this moment of being taken over isn't a failure of your emotional intelligence. It's a signal, a flare in the night sky pointing toward a piece of your psyche longing for healing. Instead of asking, how do I stop reacting this way? Perhaps the deeper question is, what is this reaction trying to protect? Because every emotional outburst, every shutdown, every spike of defensiveness is the psyche's attempt to shield a tender place within you. When you lose yourself in conflict, you aren't breaking, you're revealing. And what rises in these intense moments is precisely what needs to be met with compassion and curiosity, not judgment. Conflict doesn't show who you truly are. It shows who you've been carrying. If you peel back the layers of conflict gently, past the sharp words, the raised tones, the silence that feels like distance, you will find something surprisingly soft, almost tender, at the center of it all. Beneath every argument lies a longing to be seen, to be understood, to be felt, not just heard. We often believe that in conflict, we're fighting about the issue on the table. But in truth, most of the time we're fighting for connection. We're fighting because something inside us whispers, please don't turn away from me. Please stay. Even if the words we choose sound like the opposite. This is why Jung believed that conflict isn't merely psychological, it's relational. The psyche doesn't only seek survival, it seeks wholeness. And wholeness requires being met, seen, recognized. That's why an argument with someone who matters shakes us so deeply. The stakes are not logical, they're emotional. The fear isn't losing the debate, it's losing the bond. Think of the last time you felt your heart clamp shut in frustration. Underneath that tightness was likely a longing for closeness. Underneath the anger, a desire for warmth. Underneath the defensiveness, a plea to feel safe. Humans don't lash out because they don't care. They lash out because something in the connection feels threatened. In Jung's view, these moments are opportunities, windows into our deepest needs. He believed that the psyche doesn't speak in words, it speaks in reactions. And conflict is one of its clearest dialects. It reveals where you crave gentleness, where you fear abandonment, where you still hope to be understood without having to explain yourself. But here's the truth we rarely admit. The longing beneath conflict is universal. You want to be seen. So do they. You want to feel secure. So do they. You want to be treated with softness when you're hurting. So do they. And when we forget this shared humanity, the argument becomes a battlefield instead of a bridge. What if, instead of assuming the other person is attacking, we asked a quieter question? What are they longing for right now that they don't know how to ask for? Suddenly, the fight softens. The walls lower. Empathy returns. Conflict does not occur because two people don't care. Conflict occurs because both do. If there is a moment in conflict that holds the most transformative potential, it is the pause, the breath you take right before reacting. In that small, fragile space, the entire trajectory of the argument can shift. Because the pause is where consciousness enters. It is where the unconscious patterns, the shadow impulses, the echoes of old wounds lose their automatic power. Jung believed that awareness itself is alchemical. The simple act of noticing your reaction, without indulging it, without suppressing it, begins to change the reaction from the inside. The psyche softens under the light of observation. And suddenly, you are no longer the child defending themselves, no longer the wounded part lashing out, no longer the complex gripping the wheel. You are the witness. You are the adult. You are the one capable of choosing. Imagine recognizing your rising defensiveness and saying internally, here you are. I know why you're scared. Imagine feeling your anger surge and responding not with shame, but with curiosity. Imagine noticing your impulse to withdraw and gently asking yourself, what am I trying to protect? This is not emotional perfection. It is emotional awakening. As Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Conflict is the stage where this transformation is most visible. When you pause, you disrupt fate. You break the cycle. You meet your shadow not as an adversary, but as a teacher. This is where conflict becomes meaningful, not as a test of who's right, but as a practice of inner alignment. Every disagreement becomes a doorway into deeper self-knowledge. Every emotional spike becomes an invitation to integrate a neglected part of the psyche. Every moment of tension becomes a chance to choose presence instead of projection. And here is the quiet miracle. When you meet yourself differently, conflict with others changes too. The tone softens. The defensiveness loosens. The other person feels the shift, even if they can't name it. Because consciousness is contagious. Calm is contagious. Honesty is contagious. Arguments don't destroy relationships. Unconsciousness does. Once you begin to show up with awareness, the conflict becomes less about winning and more about understanding of yourself, of the other, of the hidden dynamics shaping both of you. In the pause, you reclaim your power. In the pause, you rewrite the pattern. In the pause, the shadow becomes light. So here we are, at the end of this journey into the hidden chambers of conflict. And maybe now, as you sit with everything we've explored, something inside you feels just a little different. Not lighter, necessarily. Not resolved, but clearer. As if the fog has thinned enough for you to glimpse the shape of something deeper. A truth you've always known, but never had the language for. Arguments were never just explosions of emotion. They were revelations. Invitations. Pathways into the parts of yourself you've spent years trying to manage, silence, or outgrow. And now, if you listen closely, you might realize the shadow you once feared is not a monster at all. It's a companion, a guide, a forgotten piece of your own wholeness. Carl Jung believed that the goal of life is not perfection but completeness. And completeness requires meeting every part of yourself. The tender parts, the angry parts, the protective ones, the wounded ones, the parts that rise too fast or stay too quiet. Conflict simply shows you where those parts lie. Imagine what becomes possible when you stop seeing arguments as threats and start seeing them as mirrors. Imagine what changes when you recognize that the tension you feel is not a sign that you're broken, but that you're growing. Imagine stepping into your next conflict not with fear, but with awareness, knowing that what appears on the surface is only the first layer of a much richer inner landscape. Because the truth is, you were never fighting the other person. You were meeting yourself. And now that you know this, the world softens. The stakes lessen. The patterns loosen. You begin to speak from your center instead of your wounds. You begin to listen from curiosity instead of fear. You begin to show up not as a collection of old defenses, but as a whole being, aware, open, evolving. And maybe that is the quiet revolution, not ending conflict, but transforming your relationship to it, turning every disagreement into a pathway back to authenticity, turning every emotional surge into a message from the soul, turning every shadow into light. If this journey stirred something inside you, if it helped you see yourself or your relationships in a new way, I invite you to stay close. This space is for reflection, growth, and consciousness, for learning to walk through life with more clarity, more compassion, more presence. Thank you for being here. Until the next journey.